What if I told you the money you work for every day isn't really money at all? Your salary, your savings, your bank balance. What if all of it is built on a promise that can be rewritten overnight? Because here's the uncomfortable truth. Modern money isn't backed by gold. It isn't backed by silver. It isn't even backed by something real. It's backed by trust. And once you understand that, you realize something terrifying. The people who control the system can create money out of nothing, destroy its value quietly, and still convince you to keep believing in it. This sounds like a conspiracy, but it's not. It's history. And the moment everything changed has an exact date, August 15, 1971. That night, the world crossed a line it can never uncross. The date was August 15, 1971. President Richard Nixon appeared on American television on a Sunday night, interrupting regular programming. With calm authority, he explained that the United States would temporarily suspend the convertibility of the dollar into gold. In other words, foreign governments could no longer exchange their dollars for the gold that had always backed them. Temporary, he said. Emergency, he said. But it was permanent. And it was revolutionary. That night, the link between money and reality was severed. Dollars were no longer promises of something tangible. They were promises of nothing but themselves, tokens of faith in a government's word. To understand why this mattered, we need to rewind. After the Second World War, global leaders had built what was called the Bretton Woods system. In it, currencies were tied to the US dollar, and the dollar was tied to gold, $35 for 1 ounce. The system worked because it gave the world stability. Inflation was controlled, trade was predictable, and gold was the ultimate anchor. But by the late 1960s, America was in trouble. It was spending heavily on the Vietnam War and on social programs at home. Dollars were flooding out into the world, but the gold reserves in Fort Knox weren't keeping pace. Foreign governments started lining up, asking to exchange their paper for real metal. And America realized it couldn't keep the promise. Nixon's announcement was supposed to be a stopgap, but no one ever reopened the gold window. By the mid-1970s, the world had entered a new era of money backed not by gold, but by decree. Economists call it fiat currency, from the Latin word for "let it be done." In practice, it meant money existed because governments said so. And for the first time in modern history, there was no natural limit to how much could be created. What's remarkable is how quietly this happened. There were no riots in the streets the next morning. Stores still sold groceries. Workers still cashed paychecks. The illusion was maintained. But beneath the surface, something profound had shifted. Humanity had stepped into a world where trust, not scarcity, was the foundation of the financial system. And once trust becomes the only anchor, history tells us it is only a matter of time before cracks appear. Because this wasn't the first time money had been untethered from reality. The Romans learned that lesson the hard way. Their coinage, once solid silver, was gradually debased by emperors desperate to fund their armies and their extravagance. Nero reduced the silver in the denarius by nearly a third. Later rulers pushed further, until the coins were little more than bronze with a silver wash. Inflation soared, confidence collapsed, and citizens turned to barter. An empire that once prided itself on order found its economy unraveling because its money was no longer trusted. Centuries later, the Yuan dynasty in China tried another experiment: paper money. At first, it was brilliant. Light, convenient, easily moved across vast distances. But soon emperors discovered the temptation every ruler faces. Why tax your people when you can just print what you need? The presses ran hot, and confidence ran cold. Merchants rejected the paper, inflation spiraled, and the grand project ended in collapse. Do you see the pattern? The technology changes, the centuries change, but the temptation remains. Whenever rulers can separate money from real value, they do it. And whenever they do it, the public pays the price. That's why Nixon's move in 1971 was not an isolated event. It was another verse in a very old song. The difference this time was scale. Rome collapsed, but the world went on. The Yuan dynasty failed, but trade survived elsewhere. But the dollar in 1971 wasn't just America's currency, It was the backbone of the global system. Once it left gold behind, the entire world followed. Currencies floated. Central banks experimented. And governments discovered the sweet drug of debt without limit. At first, it seemed to work. Freed from gold, central banks could cut rates to stimulate growth. Governments could spend freely, knowing they could always roll over their debts. And the public adapted. Inflation in the 1970s was painful, but by the 1980s and 1990s, things seemed to settle. A new orthodoxy was born, that central banks could manage the economy like an engineer tweaks a machine. They called it monetary policy. And it gave us decades of credit booms, bubbles, and crashes, each one bigger than the last. But here is the truth history makes clear. Systems like this are not designed for stability. They are designed for momentum. The debt has to keep growing, the money supply has to keep expanding, the trust has to keep being maintained. If it slows down, it risks collapse. Like a shark, it must keep swimming, or it dies. And that is where we find ourselves today. A world where money no longer has any anchor except faith, and where central banks and governments treat the printing press as the ultimate weapon. Since 1971, global debt has exploded to levels that would have been unthinkable before. In 1970, U.S. federal debt was about $370 billion. Today, it is over $34 trillion. The numbers are so large they barely register, like trying to imagine the distance to a star. And yet, this system depends on those numbers never being questioned. Think of the crises we've lived through: the dot-com bubble of the late 1990s, the housing collapse of 2008, the pandemic stimulus of 2020. Each time, the solution was the same: more money, more credit, more intervention. We are told this is stability. But it's not stability, it's acceleration. And acceleration always has a cost. You can see that cost in the erosion of purchasing power. In 1971, an ounce of gold was $35. Today it's more than $2,000. A house in the United States averaged about $25,000 in the early 1970s. Now, it's closer to $400,000. Wages have risen, yes, but not in proportion. For most people, the experience of life in this fiat era has been simple: working harder, saving less, owning less, and paying more for everything. And yet, the system insists you believe this is normal. This is not just an American story. Once the dollar abandoned gold, every other major currency followed. Europe, Japan, China, none are tied to any fixed reality. Every central bank now plays the same game, manipulating interest rates, inflating debt, and praying that trust holds. And here is the brutal truth: trust holds until it doesn't. History tells us that clearly. Look at Weimar Germany in the 1920s. Crushed by war reparations, the government printed its way out of obligations. The first, it worked. Factories restarted, workers were paid, the system sputtered forward. Then prices began to double weekly, then daily. Families carried wages in wheelbarrows. Children made kites out of worthless banknotes. And when the trust finally broke, the entire economy collapsed, leaving anger, extremism, and the seeds of an even darker era. Or consider Argentina, a nation that has defaulted on its sovereign debt 9 times in the last century. Each time, the cycle was the same: overspend, inflate, devalue, collapse, reset. And yet, ordinary Argentinians have lived through it, adjusting to a reality where saving in their national currency is folly. They keep US dollars under mattresses, or flee into property, or now, in some cases, even into cryptocurrency. That is what life looks like when money loses its meaning. But here is the uncomfortable question: if history shows this pattern, why do we believe it won't happen again on a global scale? The United States is not immune. Europe is not immune. China is not immune. The system we have built since 1971 is globalized, interconnected, and utterly dependent on one fragile thing: confidence. Once that confidence is broken, there is no easy way back. And yet, most people never stop to ask themselves the most basic question: what is money? They treat it as if it were natural, eternal, unquestionable. But money is not a law of nature. It is a human invention, a system of trust, rules, and enforcement. Once upon a time, it was seashells or salt. Then it was silver and gold. Then it was paper backed by gold. And now it is paper backed by nothing at all, or even digital entries in a bank ledger. Do you see the trajectory? Every step takes us further from reality and deeper into abstraction. And every step makes the system more vulnerable to manipulation. Which brings us to today's frontier, digital currency. Governments are racing to launch central bank digital currencies, CBDCs. They promise efficiency, convenience, instant transactions. But they also mean total control. Every transaction traceable, every dollar programmable, every citizen's financial life visible to the state. If money is already an illusion propped up by trust, imagine what happens when the same system can decide, with a keystroke, whether your money works today or doesn't. Some see cryptocurrency as the answer. Bitcoin, for example, was designed after the 2008 financial crash as digital gold. Its supply is fixed, its rules enforced by code, not politicians. In theory, it offers escape from fiat's endless inflation. But it is also volatile, vulnerable to speculation, and not yet a true replacement for the everyday money people use. It may be part of the solution or just another chapter in the same struggle. The real lesson here is not about gold, or Bitcoin, or even fiat currency itself. The real lesson is about power. Every time money is separated from something tangible, those in power gain freedom and the rest of us gain risk. Governments can spend beyond their means, corporations can borrow without discipline, banks can profit from bubbles, and ordinary citizens end up carrying the burden when it all unravels. That is the cycle. That is the trap. And it began the day money stopped being real. So what do we do with this knowledge? First, we stop pretending. We stop telling ourselves that debt doesn't matter, that inflation is temporary, that governments always know what they're doing. We look at history and recognize the signs. Second, we protect ourselves. Not by running to a single magic asset, but by understanding the system for what it is, a machine built on trust, and one that will always break down sooner or later. Financial education is the shield. Knowledge of economic history is the weapon. Real wealth is not just money, it is awareness, resilience, and the ability to adapt when illusions collapse. Because history doesn't repeat, but it rhymes. Rome's denarius, China's paper notes, Weimar's banknotes, they all remind us of the same truth. Once trust is broken, money dies. And when money dies, societies change forever. The day money stopped being real is not just a date in 1971. It is a warning, a reminder that what seems permanent never is. If this gave you a new perspective, hit subscribe. If this gave you a new perspective, hit subscribe. In this channel, history doesn't entertain, it warns. And we're here to listen.